Story 1. The Unseen Patient. You know, you don't realize how eerie a hospital can be until you're practically living in one. Working as a trauma surgeon, 24-hour shifts were more common than I'd like to admit, but that's not what keeps me up at night. It's this one night, a single incident that sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. It was a late Wednesday night, and things were unusually quiet. The constant bustle of nurses, doctors, and patients had dwindled down to a few distant murmurs. I'd just finished a tough surgery and decided to grab a coffee before catching up on some paperwork. The only coffee machine that worked at that ungodly hour was in the basement, near the old storage rooms. It was an area not frequently visited, except by janitorial staff. A chill always went up my spine every time I walked through those sterile, desolate corridors. But I was exhausted, and I needed that caffeine fix. I poured myself a cup, the machine's whirring sound echoing in the silence. As I was about to leave, I heard a noise, like a muffled voice. Thinking it was some staff working late, I decided to check it out. After all, I was still on shift, responsible for any emergencies. The sound led me down a long hallway I hadn't been to before, towards a room at the very end. As I got closer, the muffled voice became more distinct. It was a woman's voice, sounding desperate and in pain, coming from behind the door. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the rusty hinges crying out in protest. But the room was empty, save for some old, discarded equipment. There was no patient in sight, no woman in distress, nothing but the buzzing fluorescent light overhead and the faint smell of antiseptic. But then again, I heard the voice. This time it was clear. It was coming from the corner of the room.
"Help me,"
it pleaded. A cold chill ran down my spine. I quickly turned on the light, but there was still no one. A bead of sweat rolled down my forehead as I turned to leave, dismissing it as a figment of my overtired imagination. But as I reached the door, I heard it slam shut behind me. I jolted and turned around. Then the lights flickered out. I was engulfed in darkness, with just the faint glow from the hallway seeping in from underneath the door. I fumbled for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, I heard a soft whimper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was so real, so vivid that I could almost feel the despair in it.
"Help me,"
it whispered again, in my ear this time. I bolted towards the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. With a swift move, I yanked it open, and the hospital's harsh light flooded in. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the door was open. The room silent as a grave. I never found out who or what it was. No records of a room ever being there. Just an old storage space on the blueprint. The hospital dismissed it, said I was exhausted and delusional. Maybe I was. But it doesn't explain the raspy voice that haunts my dreams. The chill I feel whenever I pass that hallway. The feeling of dread that envelops me every time I remember that night. The unseen patient still roams those rooms, I think, waiting for help that never comes. And me? I'm just a doctor who failed to save a patient that wasn't there. Or was she? Story 2. The Silent Call. You know, working as a 911 operator, you'd think I'd be used to scary stuff. But there's this one encounter that really shook me. I was pulling a late-night shift at the hospital's emergency call center. It was the middle of winter, the wind howling outside, and I was cozied up with a hot cup of coffee, my eyes glued to the computer screen, earpiece snugly fit. That night was relatively quiet. A few calls here and there, but nothing out of the ordinary. But then, around 2 a.m., I received a call that would etch itself into my memory. The call started with silence. You know, the kind of silence that's not really silent, just a lack of human noise. There was no caller voice, no background noise, just the faint static that speaks of an open line. 911, what's your emergency? I repeated a few times, but there was no response. I was about to disconnect, assuming it was a pocket dial or something, when I heard it. It was a soft, whimpering sound, like someone struggling to breathe. I felt a knot in my stomach. I've taken enough calls to know the sound of someone in real distress. I tried to coax the caller to speak, to give me a location, anything that could help. But all I heard was the quiet, labored breathing and an occasional soft whimper. I alerted the hospital staff and asked for a trace on the call. It took them what felt like forever, but eventually, they got back to me. The call was coming from inside the hospital. That sent chills down my spine. Someone inside the hospital was in distress and had called 911. I ran the location to the head nurse, and they immediately dispatched a team. While they searched, I kept the line open, assuring the caller that help was on the way, but the response was just the same soft whimpering and labored breathing. The search team combed the area but found no one. The call ended abruptly about 20 minutes later. One moment, the soft, distressed sounds were there, and the next, there was only the dial tone. The line was dead. The search team couldn't locate anyone matching the situation in that part of the hospital. They chalked it up to a glitch in the system, an error in the trace. But I know what I heard. I've been doing this job long enough to know the sounds of distress, of pain, of fear. And now, every time I pass that part of the hospital, I get a cold shiver down my spine, a heavy feeling in my heart. I don't know what happened last night, who made that silent call, or what they were going through. I only know that I was helpless, that I couldn't do anything. And it's that feeling, that memory of the whimpering and the silence that still haunts me. I'm just a 911 operator who couldn't help someone from inside her own hospital. Someone who needed me and I couldn't find them. I just hope that they found peace, somehow, somewhere. Story 3. The Echoing Footsteps. So, here's a story for you. I used to be a janitor at a hospital in the heart of the city. It was a good gig for what it was, and I didn't mind the work. But this one thing happened that really creeped me out. My shift was an overnight one, and it included the basement area, which was basically a labyrinth of storage rooms and long, winding corridors. I swear, that place could give an elephant the creeps. I was used to the usual sounds, the hum of the generator, the occasional drip from a leaky pipe, the echo of my own steps. One night, around 3 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds when I heard it. Footsteps. Now, this wasn't entirely unusual. The hospital staff would sometimes come down to get supplies, but the thing is, the footsteps didn't sound right. They echoed like mine, but they were slower, more deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I called out, thinking it might be one of the staff or another janitor, but there was no reply. Just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the cold, concrete walls. The footsteps continued, unhurried and regular. Feeling a bit on edge, I decided to find out who was there. I turned a corner, flashlight leading the way, and found nothing. The corridor was empty. No one there. but the footsteps continued, echoing around me. I felt a chill down my spine. This was just wrong. I walked down the hallway, the steps still sounding behind me. I turned around several times, shining my light into the emptiness, but still, I saw nothing. Yet the steps continued, slow, measured, echoing in the silence. I sped up, trying to get back to the main part of the basement where the lights were always on and the machines hummed constantly. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, still unhurried, echoing off the walls, growing louder, closer. Just as I was about to reach the safety of the lit area, I felt a cold breeze, like a chill wind blowing through the basement corridors. I turned around one last time, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw froze me in place. There, in the light of my flashlight, were footprints forming on the dusty floor, one after another, advancing towards me. But there was no one there, just the imprints appearing on the dusty concrete. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, the echoing footsteps following me until I burst through the door to the main basement. I slammed it shut, my breath ragged, my heart racing. I don't know what was in that basement. There were no reports of intruders that night, no explanation for what I saw. From that night on, I requested a change in my area of work. I just couldn't face the basement again. I still work at the hospital, but I avoid the basement like the plague. Every so often, I hear stories from the new janitors, stories of echoing footsteps and cold breezes in the basement. I don't know what walks those basement corridors after hours, leaving footprints in its wake, but it's a night shift encounter I will never forget. I'm just a janitor, man. I didn't sign up for ghostly footsteps and unseen stalkers. Whatever is down there, it can keep the basement. I'm good with the rest of the hospital.